It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Welcome back to Wellesley. I hope everybody got to see it yesterday when it was looking very beautiful before we returned to the rainy season. We haven't had spring this year. We only had rainy season. I know you didn't come here to hear the faculty complain about the weather, so I will talk about game theory. I have been at Wellesley for 14 years now, and I've taught a number of different courses, as Laura just said, but my favorite course by far is definitely the introductory game theory course that I have been teaching at Wellesley for the last 8 years or so. I always tell my students that learning game theory will help them in their careers, particularly if they go into business or politics, which many of our students do. And the interesting thing is that they tend to comment at the end of the semester not about the business applications of game theory or the political applications of game theory, but more about the fact that learning game theory has changed the way they think about everything they do every day of their lives. It changes the way they think about how they interact with their roommates, their parents, their boyfriends, et cetera, and sometimes they really aren't too happy with me about that. But I don't think I can have such a big impact on you today in 45 minutes, but this is my opportunity to share some of my favorite examples with you, maybe teach you a little game theory along the way as well. Okay. It's also my chance to show off Wellesley's fancy new high-technology Pendleton East. This is a document camera. It's taking a picture of the slide that I have on here, and if I think I have it on freeze, actually. Yeah, I can actually take this off. This is a piece of paper. It's just projecting the paper onto the screen for you. So what that means is that when we're teaching class, if you have the book, you can just stick the book right under there, and it'll project the book onto the screen for you. So it's been very exciting to have a new building. At any rate, let me start by telling you a little bit about what game theory is before we get to think about how to use it. Game theory can be used to analyze any situation in which there is strategic interdependence among agents. All right? And agents can be people, they can be firms, they can be countries, can be anything. And strategic interdependence arises whenever the outcome of your decisions depends also on someone else's decisions. Okay? So in strategic interactions, we call them games. In games, what you get at the end depends on what you do, and it depends on what other players do, and vice versa. Okay, so what they get depends not just on what they do, but also on what you do. And my goal for today, for the next 45 minutes or so, is to try to convince you that you actually need to know something about game theory because it's relevant to so many different pieces of our world and as well to so many pieces of everyday life. Okay? Game theory has actually become a bit of a hot topic recently, primarily because of the Academy Award-winning film starring Russell Crowe up there as John Nash. The film's called A Beautiful Mind. It won the Best Picture Award in 2002. The movie is a slightly fictionalized version of the life of game theorist and mathematician John Nash, Jr. But the film brought the concept of Nash Equilibrium into the public eye and left many people wondering just what this Nash Equilibrium and game theory were all about. Part of that is due to the fact that if you've seen the film, they flash a sentence at the start of the film suggesting that the impact of Nash's equilibrium concept in the social sciences, quote, is comparable to that of the discovery of the DNA double helix in the biological sciences. That's probably a bit strong. But from a game theorist perspective, that's not actually as problematic as the fact that the film doesn't get the concept right. And I'll come back to that later, right? I'm actually going to start somewhere else, but I will come back to the film. Even before A Beautiful Mind was released, television started to run their Survivor series. Anybody seen Survivor ever? Any little bit or piece of it? No. Even if you haven't seen it, lots of other people in the world have. the series really captured the imagination of a lot of viewers, a fair number of tabloid reporters, a number of Wellesley College students who were asking whether there was an ideal strategy that you could use to win the $1 million prize on Survivor. All right. From my perspective, the idea that there are strategies to play or that strategic thinking can be beneficial seems to be spreading out there in the world, and people seem to want to know how the process works. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to try and find out how the process works while we're here this afternoon. All right. Turns out that Survivor, which actually just finished its most recent run a couple weeks ago, I think that was Survivor 6, the Amazon. Survivor is a great place to go for examples to show how strategic thinking can help you. All right. The best example, which is starting to be a classic one for teachers of game theory, is from the last episode of the original series of Survivor, which actually aired, I believe, in the summer of 2000. Okay, so here's the scenario. Let's, there we go. This is the last episode of Survivor. There were 16, I believe, people left on an island, and these are the 3 left, okay? Richard, who's known as Rich, Rudy, and Kelly. They're the last 3. They are, in this last episode of the show, competing for the right to claim immunity from the next to last vote, okay? And what that means is that if they win immunity, they're guaranteed to go on to be one of the final 2 people in the series, and they literally get to choose who goes with them. Since you can't vote for the person who wins immunity in the vote, each of the other 2 people have to vote for each other, and you then get to pick which of the 2 get to go on with you to be in the final 2. Okay. When there are only 2 left, a jury of the most recently voted off castaways comes back. I think it's 7 total. They vote for the person who wins the money at the end. All right. The immunity challenge in question in this particular episode is that the 3 of them have to stand on these little wooden pedestals, and there's this big thing they call the immunity idol. And you have to stand on this pedestal, put your hand on the immunity idol, and then you just have to stand there. And every hour or so, you have to step down from your pedestal and move to another person's pedestal and step back up again. But you have to keep your hand on the whole time. Okay? So the last person standing with their hand on this thing wins. Okay? What happens? Well, it takes 2.5 hours. Not on television. On television, it only takes a couple minutes. But after 2.5 hours, Richard Hatch, who's over there on the left, he's the eventual sole survivor. He wins the $1 million. He steps down from his position. Okay, he's just standing up there. He's kind of looking around. He takes his hand off. He steps down. Wow. Everybody who's watching television is like, oh my, why did he do that? Okay, I'm watching the show. I'm like, oh, great use of backward induction. Okay, so now you know that I am a nerdly game theorist. But Richard Hatch was truly clever, all right? And we're going to see why in a minute. Okay, first, let me say that Survivor, not just the original series, but a couple of other series as well, has been a fabulous textbook example of strategic interaction. It's literally going to be a textbook example soon when the 2nd edition of my textbook comes out. But the reason that it's really interesting from a teaching perspective is that you can't win the $1 million on Survivor just by making good decisions for yourself, right? You really have to take everybody else's actions into consideration. Right? You can't just ignore them. All right. Anytime that is true, right, that you can't ignore what kind of decisions other people are making, the tools of game theory are going to be useful to you. Right? One crucial analytical tool, analytical skill, if you want to call it that, for anyone who's involved in a strategic interaction, all right, anybody who we would call a game player, is the skill of backward induction. Okay, it's also called rollback. Rollback requires that you look forward to the end point of a particular interaction and then reason back to the current point in time in order to figure out what your ideal course of action should be. All right? Richard Hatch did exactly that. Okay? How do I know? Well, he actually has suggested as much in post-game interviews, but we can also use game theory to analyze his situation and see why that was the right thing to do. Okay? So, we have our 3 survivors. Okay. And we have some information that we can use about them and their situation in the game in order to understand the game better. Okay? 3 things that we know from having watched earlier episodes in this particular series. One is that Rudy, who's an ex-Navy SEAL, is very much liked by all of the other people who had been on the island with him, and he is definitely likely to be the winner, almost guaranteed, if he makes it to the final 2. Okay, so that's the first thing we know. Second thing we know is that Rich and Rudy have had an alliance for most of the series. It's a very strong alliance. They have guaranteed not to vote each other off the island. Third thing we know is that Kelly has a very good chance of winning this particular immunity challenge. She's won something like the last 5 in a row. All right, she's very tenacious. She's a very likely winner. Rudy has absolutely the worst chance of winning. Okay. So we use those 3 pieces of information, and we can think about the different possible endings to this game. Okay, there's 3 possible endings. One of the 3 of these people could win immunity. If Rich wins immunity, he's guaranteed to be in the final 2. Okay, but his only chance of actually winning the $1 million is if Rudy doesn't go to the final 2 with him. All right, so from Rich's perspective, if he wins immunity, he'd really rather to keep Kelly with him to go into the final 2. Problem is that everybody on the island knows he has this alliance with Rudy. All right, so he'd have to vote Rudy off the island in order to win the $1 million, and that's going to make him look bad. The jury's not going to like him for that. All right, if that's true, then it's likely that if he votes Rudy off and keeps Kelly, he has probably less than a 50-50 chance of winning the money. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is that Kelly is the one who wins the immunity challenge. All right, if that were to happen, she also doesn't want to go to the final 2 with Rudy, because almost 100% guaranteed he's going to win if she is the other option for the 2 people for the jury to choose from. Okay, so she's going to want to keep Rich. So if Kelly wins immunity, it's likely that Rich is also going to the final 2. All right, that's slightly better for Rich, though, because then he gets to the final 2 without having to kick Rudy off himself. And then his chances of winning the $1 million are probably better than 50-50. So it's 2 scenarios. The third scenario is that Rudy wins. Nobody actually thinks this is going to happen. If it were to happen, however, everyone expects that Rudy's going to abide by his alliance, keep Rich. Rich still gets in the final 2, but he's probably not going to win the money. Okay? So Rich is standing up there, and he's on his little pedestal, and he's got his hand on the immunity idol, and basically he figured out that the probabilities were all in his favor. No matter what he did, he's going to make it to the final 2. Okay? So stepping down isn't going to hurt him. And the fact of the matter is that stepping down could help him, because his best chance of winning the money is when Kelly wins the immunity challenge, and that's something that's almost guaranteed to happen once he steps down. Okay? So he didn't have to stand there and battle it out. It was very hot. He could hop down, eat some orange slices that the host had put out there temptingly on a little side table for them, and he could go for a swim. All right? A+ in games of strategy. Oh, yeah. He also won $1 million. Okay? But A+ at Wellesley is way more prestigious than Okay. So why am I making a big deal out of all this? Partially because I got to reply to queries from both my colleagues and my students after this whole thing was over with a concrete example of how strategic thinking helped Richard win $1 million on Survivor. But it's also important because there are actually a lot of places in life where you could help yourself by thinking ahead and reasoning back in the same way. Some of those places aren't really very important. Okay? So take tic-tac-toe, for example. When you play tic-tac-toe, you have to think about what the other person's going to do next, and then sort of think back to, well, what should I do now given what the other person's going to do after I do this? Right? It's the same idea. You can actually solve, quote unquote, tic-tac-toe using rollback for a guaranteed never lose strategy, which most of you probably know, but you used rollback to figure that out. So, all right, not very important. But other examples of rollback are more substantive. Okay, software firms, auto manufacturers, political candidates, international negotiators, all need to look ahead to the consequences of their actions and to the reactions of rivals before making choices. Choices about pricing policies, choices about entry or expansion into new markets, choices about advertising campaigns, choices about political platform construction, choices about bargaining stands. Okay? And I could go on and on and on. There are lots and lots of different places where you could use these kinds of ideas to your benefit. All right. For a specific example, let's think about fancy bottled tea drinks. All right, like the kind that Snapple makes, Nantucket Nectars makes some, and there's also a new brand called Honest Tea. Anybody had any Honest Tea recently? Honest Tea is important, if only because it's started and run by two gentlemen, one of whom is a game theorist, and the other of whom is the son of a Wellesley Emeritus faculty member. So Honest Tea has to get into my talk. You know how it works. Anyway, as Snapple, Nantucket Nectars, and Honest Tea are considering their advertising or pricing strategies, they need to consider the future impact of those strategies on the decisions or the behavior of potential entrants into this market. Okay, so potential entrants into that market might be firms like Coca-Cola, which owns the Fruitopia line of drinks. Example, all right? Whether or not these tea drinks choose to try a big advertising push with relatively low prices as a way to build a large, loyal client base, that's going to impact Coca-Cola's ability to profitably enter the market, all right? Because the success of any future entry attempt is going to hinge on the behavior of the current incumbents in the market, strategic thinking on their part is definitely required. Right? In truth, Cadbury Schweppes owns both Nantucket Nectars and Snapple, and they're one of Coke's biggest competitors. So the implications are actually wider than I've implied. But those kinds of interactions in the market can be very important. Game theorists would group all of those examples that I've been talking about so far and explain that they are all examples of what we would call sequential games. Right? Games in which actions take place in sequence and players can observe what's happened in the past. So you can see previous actions on the parts of other players. Right? We illustrate games like that, sequential games, with something called a game tree. And we use trees then to help us predict behavior in those games. So for example, in the tea game that I just described, this is what the game tree would look like. Okay. No, it's not. We have to take the freeze off. There we go. So there we go. There's a game tree. And what I've done is shown that the Snapple, Nantucket Nectars, Honest Tea firms can choose whether to have lots of ads or not. And then Coca-Cola is going to decide whether or not it wants to enter this particular market. If we rank the profit levels associated with different actions, right, where 4 is best and 1 is worst, we can then make an argument about what the incumbent firms should do here. All right. Rollback reasoning tells us to start at the end of the tree. All right. So look at Coca-Cola's situation at the top. They have a choice between a 2 and a 1 at the end. So staying out of the market from that point gives them a 2. They'll go that way. At the bottom, same kind of argument can be made to show since 4 is better than 2, they'd like to come in if they're down there. Then you roll back through the tree. You look at the decision for the tea manufacturers at the first point in the tree there, the first node. And they can look ahead to see what Coca-Cola is likely to do, figure out that their options lead them either to a 3 or a 2, and they can then see that they should, in fact, choose to push their products to the limit in order to diminish the profitability of entry for Coca-Cola. All right? So you see the tea manufacturers choosing to do advertising. Not surprisingly, not all trees are that easy to handle. Okay, and I just ranked them. Okay, it's based on profitability of entry. If you are Snapple and you do a lot of advertising, that's costly. Okay, but if you don't do very much advertising, that's not costly. So if you are in the market by yourself and you haven't done any advertising and Coke stays out, that's the best for you. That's where the 4 comes from. All right, and the other numbers come similarly. Okay, we can come back to that at the end if you want. Okay, what I wanted to do now, though, is to look at another example of a tree. This is a little more complicated. This is the game tree for the survivor example that I just went through. Okay. So the tree is a little bit more complicated, but the analysis is actually identical to what I just explained. Okay. You roll back from each of these endpoints, trying to figure out what people would do, what the probabilities are, and you can get all the way back to the left side of the tree where Rich is trying to decide whether he should give up or continue. All right? And all of the calculations from this tree, as you roll back through it, will tell you that from Rich's perspective, at the very beginning point where he's standing right now, if he gives up, his probability of winning is equal to Q. Q is greater than a half, so better than 50-50 shot if he gives up, but something actually less than Q if he continues. Right? So the game tree is telling you exactly what we explained before, that Rich should in fact give up. Obviously, I'm not going to argue that he drew a tree, but especially since he had his hand on the immunity idol. But he definitely did the appropriate analysis, thought about the probabilities, and chose his best strategy. Okay. All of the interactions that I've talked about so far fit into this sequential definition that I gave you. But I assume that you're probably already thinking that not all strategically interesting situations are sequential, because you can't always see what everybody else did before you get to decide what to do. Some strategic situations must be simultaneous. Of course that's true. Right? Sometimes you have to make a strategic choice without knowing what other players, okay, what everybody that you're interacting with is going to do. All right? You're not knowing what they're going to do makes the game simultaneous, even if technically they make their decision an hour, a day, a week, a month, whatever, after you've made your decision, as long as you can't change your mind. Okay? A presidential election is a big, giant, simultaneous play game. Right? Every individual voter makes a decision and acts on it without observing the choices made by other people. Mostly, unless you live on the West Coast and you watch a lot of exit polls and you vote late in the day. All right? But millions of people across the country do that over the course of a day, and the outcome of the process depends on the decisions made by each of the individuals all put together. Okay? Big, giant, simultaneous play game. Simultaneous interactions like that are also amenable to game theoretic analysis. In fact, the most well-known example of a strategic game is one that is simultaneous, and that's the game that's known as the prisoner's dilemma. I assume that many people will actually have heard of the prisoner's dilemma already. The classic story involves two people who have been arrested for some crime, a robbery maybe, and they did indeed commit this crime. And they're being interrogated by the police in two separate rooms. Okay, so the police have them separated, and they tell them this is the way this is going to work. The standard sentence for the crime that we believe but cannot prove that you have committed is 15 years. All right. If you both confess, we'll cut it to 8 in return for your cooperation. All right. If neither of you confesses, though, since we can't actually prove that you did what we think you did, you'll probably only be convicted of a lesser crime, and you'll end up with maybe 3 years in jail. All right. Last but not least, if you tell us what really happened and your partner doesn't, we're going to cut you a really good deal, so you only have to go to jail for a year, and your partner's going to go for 15. Of course, if you deny responsibility and he confesses, then you're going to get the 15 and he's going to get the 1. So what happens in that game? Well, this is the kind of game that we illustrate with a game table rather than a tree. One player is going to pick the row of the table. One player is going to pick the column of the table. And outcomes for each individual are indicated within each of the cells in that table. Okay. If you take a look at this, obviously the best thing for the pair of them together is to be down here, all right, where they each get a 3-year sentence. But think about it as if you were one of these prisoners, okay? You don't know what your partner's going to do. But if you're prisoner 1, you can think, all right, suppose that my partner chooses to confess, so that we're in this column right here. Well, if he's going to confess, then really I should confess, because then I'll get an 8-year sentence instead of a 15-year sentence. Okay. Well, what if he chooses to deny any involvement? That's going to put me over here in this column. Well, then I should still confess, because I'll get a 1-year sentence instead of a 3-year sentence. All right. So the best thing for you to do individually is to confess to the crime. In game theoretic lingo, we would say that you have a dominant strategy here. All right. There's a strategy and action that's always best for you, no matter what the other person does. Okay. No matter what they do, whether they confess or they deny, it's definitely better for you to confess. The same is true for your partner, because this is a symmetric game. All right. Both of your situations are the same. If you both use your dominant strategies, you end up in this box of the table, where you both get the 8-year sentence. Okay. But that is, of course, obviously not what you would have preferred. Okay. Well, how does that happen? Well, it happens because it's a dilemma. That's why it's called the prisoner's dilemma. The jointly preferred outcome here, the one where they both get 3 years, is generally not the one that occurs. The way we would explain that in game theory is to say that the jointly preferred outcome is not the Nash equilibrium of this game. Okay, and that brings us back to John Nash. What does it mean to be in Nash equilibrium? Well, let's go back to A Beautiful Mind now. Okay. In the film A Beautiful Mind, there's an example that they use that takes place in a bar. All right. And John Nash and 3 of his friends from graduate school are discussing how to divide their attentions among a group of women. Okay. So there's 4 guys, there's 5 women. One of them is a blonde. The blonde is the one who's coveted by all of the men. And then there are 4 brunettes. All right. Nash equilibrium does not mean that the guys in this scene should all pick the brunettes and ignore the blonde, which is in fact what Russell Crowe says they should do. Yeah, I'll get there in a minute. Which is in fact what Russell Crowe says they should do in the film. Okay. You can think about this game in this particular way, with this table where I have collapsed the game to be one just between John Nash and his friend Milner, rather than among all 4 of them, because it's just a little bit too hard to show how it worked then. Okay. So here I have thought about what the game might look like in a game table. And the idea here is that the solitary blonde, there's only one blonde, is indecisive. And she's going to reject both guys if they both try to win her hand simultaneously. But she would accept a single invitation, all right, if just one of the guys approaches her. All right. The men, for their part, most prefer to have the blonde to themselves, but most dislike it if their rival gets her. Okay? The payoff structure is based on that reasoning. And the pattern of payoffs here is exactly the same as in the previous slide in the prisoner story. Okay? The outcome is going to be similar too. Both guys strictly prefer to go for the blonde. And when they do, they get nothing. Okay. Again, there's a jointly preferred outcome here where they both choose a brunette. And although that is the outcome that's referred to in the film, it is not the Nash equilibrium of the game. The Nash equilibrium is for both of them to choose to try to get the blonde and then to end up with Zippo. So we're back to where I started, though, a minute ago. All we know is that you play these prisoner dilemma type games and you end up getting not what you wanted because of this Nash equilibrium thing. So what is Nash equilibrium? Put simply, John Nash's Nobel Prize winning idea is that people will do the best they can given the choices made by other players in the game. All right? That means that you are in equilibrium. All right? You're in Nash equilibrium, literally, when every player has made a decision, and after discovering the decisions of all of the other players, no one wants to change what they chose. No one wants to change their mind. Okay? In this bar dilemma, the Nash equilibrium is for both guys to go for the blonde. Although neither gets her, when each looks at what the other person chose, each is happy with his decision. All right? If both had gone for the brunette, trying to get to this better outcome down here, each one, after the fact, would want to change his mind and go for the blonde. Okay? To get the absolute highest payoff in that table. So both going for the brunettes is not a Nash equilibrium. Each player would regret his choice ex post. And if there's ex post regret, you can't have Nash equilibrium. All right? It doesn't matter if you don't like the payoff that you get. It only matters if you regret what you chose once you see what the other people picked.
Why can't you change your mind twice?
You can only approach the girls once. Once you've done it, you've done it. Okay? It's certainly true that this version of the prisoner's dilemma, and particularly the prisoner's story of the prisoner's dilemma, seems contrived, certainly, but not very realistic. And people tend to complain that, that doesn't really apply to situations that happen in the real world. Two responses to that, I guess. One is that if you ever watch primetime television, which I know some of you do because I know I saw a few hands at the Survivor thing, and you watch the television cop shows, they use that strategy all the time, right? And they use it because it works, because joint confession is the Nash equilibrium of the game. But that's still television, which isn't real life, admittedly. But there are some real-life examples of prisoners' dilemmas that are fairly relevant. One of them is an example about using a lawyer in labor arbitration cases, so firms versus unions. You can gain substantially in those kinds of situations by having a lawyer if the other side doesn't. But you certainly want to have a lawyer if the other side does. There's a very intriguing paper in the economics literature called Lawyers as Agents of the Devil in a Prisoner's Dilemma Game. Not my paper, I'm just reading the title. But this paper shows that outcomes in these arbitration cases in terms of decisions, which way the decision goes, and how much money is awarded, decisions don't differ substantially between situations in which both sides have a lawyer and situations in which neither side does. All right? What that means is that this prisoner's dilemma thing leads to a situation with which both sides choose to use a lawyer because they feel like they have to at great expense, but they don't gain very much from having done so. A second example occurs with state funding to attract commercial enterprises to the state. A state can gain a lot in terms of tax revenue and employment opportunities for its citizens by spending state money to get businesses to locate within the state. So you usually offer tax rebates or other sorts of fiscal rewards to get firms to relocate. All right? You gain the most from doing that if other states are not doing it. Okay? But if they are doing it, you really want to do it too. And you want to offer something that's similar to what they offer so that you aren't deserted by your own local businesses. Okay? In the end, though, if every state is offering a similar package of relocation incentives, then businesses don't make their location decisions based on those packages anymore. They just make their decisions based on whatever they were going to make their decision on in the first place in the absence of the packages. All right? So you just spent a lot of money and you didn't get very much in return. All right? That's another prisoner's dilemma. And there are many, many more. I won't go into gory detail. What I'm hoping, though, is that the examples that we've been talking about at least help to convince you that the prisoner's dilemma isn't completely contrived, and that understanding the game can be worthwhile in some real-world situations. There's still some lingering discomfort, I think, always, certainly with my students and even in the profession, with not being able to attain that better outcome that's up there. All right? And in game theory, we would phrase that by saying, can't we solve the prisoner's dilemma? And the answer is maybe. There's been a lot of research done on solutions to the prisoner's dilemma. I'll just tell you about the most common one, since it seems to be the one that sort of seems most likely to happen in the real world. The cooperative outcome does seem to arise in situations in which the game that you're playing or the relationship between the players is repeated. Okay, so these kinds of interactions happen over and over again. Then nasty, uncooperative behavior in one play of the game or one particular type of interaction can lead to retaliation from your rival in later plays of the same game or in other interactions that you have with the same person. Okay? Knowing that that's possible, knowing the kind of penalties that you might pay in the future can be enough to get players to cooperate, often for long periods, within a repeated version of the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so repetition of the dilemma has been put forth as one possible solution to help players move from the bad outcome to the good outcome. Okay. What about other simultaneous games? Okay, the only one we've talked about so far is the prisoner's dilemma. Let me go back to the example that I gave before about an election. Okay, and what I'm going to do is talk about our most recent presidential election. I'm not a politician. There was a lot of discussion at the time, even in the newspapers, about the strategic aspects of voting in that particular election. Why? Because of the presence of third-party candidate Ralph Nader. Okay, Ralph Nader. All right. In the final 2 weeks before the election, an American billionaire, at his own expense, placed ads in major newspapers across the country asking people to vote for Nader. Okay? This is what they said. All right? This is from the Boston Globe, October 29th, 2000. Why voting for a candidate who can't win is the smartest thing you'll ever do. Okay? So we have these ads, and they are placed only in newspapers in states in which one candidate was well ahead. All right, so states that were clearly going either to Gore or to Bush, one or the other. All right. The strategy here was not to help Bush win by pulling needed votes from Gore's side of the aisle into Ralph Nader. Okay? That strategy could have been adopted. All right, but that was not, in fact, what was going on here. The strategy was to help the Green Party get 5% of the national vote so that it could achieve recognition from the Federal Election Commission as a significant political party. Okay? And if that had happened, the Green Party would have been eligible for federal matching funds for its campaigns in 2004. Okay? So that was the goal. Thinking very strategically, all right, this is very small, I apologize. The billionaire who paid for these ads, who, by the way, calls himself Citizens for Strategic Voting. What he did was he staked out states like Massachusetts, New York, Texas, states in which one candidate was well ahead. All right? Since the race was considered all but over in those states, the argument was that left-leaning voters could safely, quote-unquote, vote for Nader without fear of harming Gore. All right? In a state like Massachusetts that was clearly going to go for Gore, all right, you could vote for Nader, get him some of the popular vote. Similarly, in Texas, which was clearly going to go for Bush, you could vote for Nader instead of Gore because you weren't going to hurt him. All right? And there's a whole big, long explanation on this ad about how that was all going to work. Okay, so it's all right there in black and white for you to figure out. Of course, this is a simultaneous game, so people couldn't know in advance what others might do. But it's safe to say that probably some people were moved by these newspaper ads into the Nader camp once they understood the strategic impact of their vote. Help the Green Party without hurting the Democratic candidate. The other thing that happened in this election is that as the vote got even closer, vote-swapping sites sprang up on the internet so that people who wanted to vote for Nader in states that were needed by Gore, okay, states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Maine, all right, they would vote for Gore, while a Gore supporter in a state that Bush was going to win, Texas, Colorado, Wyoming, would vote for Nader. So Nader still got his vote, but Gore got votes in states that he really needed. All right. Did either of those strategies actually work? Good question. It's been proposed that the vote swapping did actually help Gore. I'm not sure that's true. He did win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Maine. Those are some of the states where the vote swapping was most common. Obviously, it didn't help him enough. From the perspective of Ralph Nader, it didn't really help him either. His Green Party ended up with, I think, 2.7% of the popular vote, which was not, in the end, enough to qualify the party for federal matching funds. Okay. But it was quite entertaining for game theorists to watch all of the strategic voting going on. So, you know, then you have things to talk about when you come to reunion. We've now seen both categories, major categories of strategic games, both sequential games and simultaneous games. I could certainly keep going on and on and on and on. I do usually teach this for a whole semester. But instead, I'm going to wrap up by saying that I hope I've shown you that there are a lot of places in your life, in the economy, in politics, and, you know, everywhere, in which game theoretic reasoning has a role to play. Strategic interactions are actually everywhere. The analytical tools that I've been talking about can help you decipher what you should do in such situations. They can help you predict what other people might do, too, and sometimes that's very useful. Just to try to convince you, one more time, that it's worth knowing a little bit about game theory, I'm going to end with, I call this a cautionary tale, that shows the importance of being always alert to the strategic possibilities around you. This is an example that I use to motivate my students. Always think strategically, I say. But it also serves as a nice little modern fable with a moral about the use of rollback. Okay, so here's the story. This is apparently a true story, actually. We have now found out that it's not apocryphal. We have identified the faculty member in question and spoken to him at Duke University. There are two friends. They're taking chemistry at Duke. They have solid A's going into the final exam. Okay? They're very, very confident about this particular course. So the weekend before the final, they hear about this really, really great party at UVA. Okay? Duke, UVA, kind of far apart. So they decide they're going to go to this party. They're not too worried about it. You know, okay, the chemistry exam's on Monday, but it'll be fine. We'll be back in plenty of time to study for the exam on Sunday night. Problem is, they go to the party, and the party was so good that they ended up sleeping most of Sunday, and they really get back too late to study for the chemistry final on Monday morning. These are good students. They have A's going into the final. Rather than take the final completely unprepared, they go to the professor with a sob story. They go to the professor with a sob story, okay? And what they say is that we went to this party at the University of Virginia, and it was really fun, and we were coming back to study for the final, but we got a flat tire on the way. and we were, for whatever reason, not driving on the main road, and it was very deserted, and there was nobody to help us, and it took us a really, really long time, and by the time we got the tire fixed and got back to campus, it was really too late, and please, 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 can we take the final tomorrow? So the professor thinks it over, and clearly this is not Wellesley because he agrees. So they are very pleased with themselves, okay? They have the whole day ahead of them. They study for their chemistry final. They're very pleased. They show up on the next morning. The professor has the exam all ready for them, hands them each a copy of the exam, puts them in separate rooms, and says, go ahead. So they're very relieved. They sit down. They read the first question. It's worth 10 points. Very straightforward. They write their answers. They're feeling great. They flip the page. And on the second page, there's one question. It's worth 90 points. Let this be a lesson to you. Just remember that the people around you might be good game players too. All right? You need to be prepared. Okay? I will leave you with that as food for thought. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your reunion weekend.